Hi, everybody. My name is Shiza, and today I'm going to be analyzing this research paper, which is called Transfusion Understanding Transfer Learning for Medical Imaging. And the reason why I'm looking at this research paper right now is because I was on a call with an AI expert, and he was asking me about my segmentation project, which was basically segmenting brain tumors from MRI scans. And so he was asking me, well, this has 93% accuracy, but how do you know that it's for sure 93% unless you test it out on other data sets as well? But the thing is, like, there's not that many open source data sets other than the one I found on Kaggle, which got 93%. And then I'm looking into that, but the thing is, like, it's just not available. I mean, government's really restricted in giving data in terms of healthcare. And so if I'm currently looking into processes in which I could get it, so like, reaching out to institutions and hospitals, such as UHN to see like if they have any data that I could use to test out this model. And so I'm currently looking into that right now. But as a really good stepping stone, I wanted to read this research paper. And so in this research paper, it starts off by talking about how transfer learning has become an actual, like, pretty ubiquitous application in terms of medical imaging. And what transfer learning really relies on is natural image data sets, particularly Imagenet, which is basically this huge data set that has 1,000 classes and over 1 million images. So it's really big. But then if you're comparing Imagenet to like medical data sets, obviously there's fundamental differences in the data sizes, in the features, in the task specifications between those two. And so there's not that much understanding on the effects of the transfer. And so in this paper, we're exploring the properties of transfer learning for biomedical imaging, so that specific niche. And so a performance evaluation that they have is two medical imaging tasks, one with retinal fundus images and one with X-ray scans. So looking into both of them, they're found surprisingly that transfer learning within medical imaging is actually offering little benefit to the performance, surprisingly. So, comparing between the pre trained parameters and the random initialization, there is not much of a difference. And other than this, another thing is that simple lightweight models, so things that don't have that many blocks or stages in a model that's very simplistic, can actually perform pretty similarly than a model that's pretty complex, such as image architectures. And so the reason why they think this might be is because of the overparameterization of standard models. And overparameterization is basically that the number of parameters is much larger than the number of training data. So as you can see from picture number one, you see that the number of nodes might be limited, but look at the connections between the nodes. Or you could also call them neurons, these round things. Like there's so many of them. There's so many parameters, there's so many weights. All of these are causing the overparameterization. Other than this, we're also looking into benefits of transfer arising from weight scalings, and we'll be looking into that more. So in terms of the introduction, it starts by saying that the present standard within transfer learning and medical imaging specifically is that you're taking an existing architecture that's designed for natural image data sets. So let's say you're taking ImageNet. So you now have the architecture. But now you're also corresponding it with pre-trained weights. So these pre-trained weights can be from other CNN architectures such as ResNet, Inception Volume 3, stuff like that. And so when you're binding the architecture and the pre-trained weights and putting it together, you can now fine-tune the model on the medical imaging data and the tasks that you have. And so this has been the most ubiquitous within this specific niche and within different medical specialties. So it talks about some examples. So, for example, in radiology, um, you're training on architectures like the pre-trained weights of architecture such as ResNet and DenseNet on chest X-rays. And you can see over here, these are the examples of this data set of chest X-rays. There's also, you're looking at more of the eye industry in terms of retinal fundus images, which are over here. And there's also other applications but these are the two you'll be focusing on in this research paper. And then we also have Imagenet, which, as you can see, like these images are not really even close to each other. Like they're not similar at all. And so that basically shows like the fact that there's literally 1,000 classes. I find that pretty interesting as well. And so, even though there's been a lot of popularity within transfer learning and medical imaging, like there's not that many people who know about the precise effects of it. Like, how precise is it? Why is it so precise? How does it really work? And so, going back to first principles, like that's really crucial. And that's why I wanted to start with this research paper as well. So, there's many open questions within medical imaging because if it doesn't necessarily result in performance improvements, that goes to show like, well, then what's the point, right, of the transfer learning? And so um, we'd be exploring that in the research paper too, and it does talk about that a lot. But before we get to that, we're looking at the difference between ImageNet and the biomedical data sets. And so it talked about this in the abstract that there's fundamental differences between data sizes, features, and task specifications. So those are the main three things. But to go a bit deeper into them, so in medical imaging, what happens is you have some sort of very large, but you have a very large image, and you have some sort of bodily region of interest that you want. So let's say you're looking at chest X-rays, like in this example over here, then the region of interest could be the white opaque patches that are a sign of consolidation and pneumonia. So over here, like this would be the region of interest, so you know what the region of interest is. But then, in contrast to natural image data sets such as ImageNet, there is a very specific global subject of the image. And so that brings the concern of like, well, if there's ImageNet and it's very specific on what we want it to be, I mean, is it even useful to reuse the features for medical images if that's a bit more vague? Like, how would that process go? This is very similar to the next one because um, most data sets have large larger images, but then with this one, like compared to ImageNet, which has like over a million, you know, um, medical data sets don't have that many. And so because of that, like, there's gonna be obviously several thousands, couple 100,000 images in the medical data sets, but then there's gonna be a million in ImageNet. So that having a lot of images and a lot of computations is obviously you're gonna have larger images, right? Also, like the fact that because of that, like it leads to that same thing of over parameterization, and so that's also a problem. Another thing is medical tasks don't have that many classes compared to ImageNet because ImageNet has like 1,000, and so the one with the eyes, the retinal fundus images, that has 5 classes, and then 5 to 14 of them are for the chest X-rays and what you can find from them. So obviously, it's like, well, we're gonna have more weights and parameters and nodes and connections, and that's gonna cause over parameterization as well because now since you have a lot of classes, well, you have to adjust to that, right? So you can't just take the architecture of ImageNet and then put it into a medical data set or task. So that's like where it gets inefficient. And so in the research paper, they have some sort of study of transfer learning for medical images, and these are their four main contributions. First of all, they're evaluating the performance of the standard architectures for natural images. So they have, again, as we looked into ImageNet, and there's also a family of non-standard but very simple and small models, just so you can compare, because as we know in the abstract, it said that when you're comparing the simple and lightweight models and you're comparing it to image or like complex architectures such as the ImageNet architectures, then it does give you some insight into transfer learning and how they're very comparable to each other because of their similarities. So this was the first key finding that or their contribution that they had, because they found that, again, as we mentioned, the transfer does not help the performance that much. The smaller simple architectures are comparable to the standard image net models, and then the image net models is not predictive of the medical performances. And so that's the key finding that they had, first of all. Then they also talked about how they wanted to look within hidden representations and just learned representations using CCA, which is like a technique that they use to analyze these hidden representations. And so they found that pre-training does affect the hidden representations, but then there's also things about the model size and how standard ImageNet models don't change significantly through the fine-tuning process, where we're like when we're binding the algorithm and the pre-trained weights together and then fine-tuning, like it just doesn't change that much, especially within certain parts of the model, and we'll look into that because there's graphs as well for that. The third one was that like using weight transfusion experiments, which is where the name of the research paper comes in, we're also partially reusing pre-trained weights, and we isolate locations where meaningful reuse does occur. So when we're like increasing the accuracy and stuff like that, when it's actually beneficial, like we want to keep that part, and then what isn't working out, we want to have alternatives, and this is where like the hybrid approach comes in. And so because of this, like in the research paper near the end of it, it talks about some of the hybrid approaches that you could have in terms of transfer learning within medical imaging. And the fourth key finding is that there's also feature independent benefits to pre-training because of the weight scaling and then the large gains in convergence speed. And convergence speed is basically the rate at which um, like the computer can learn, let's say. So for example, how fast can it learn about all the features and the angles, and then get that all together to get more insight into what's actually in the image and perform the task. So then we move on to data sets, and then as I mentioned, we wanted to use two. So we wanted to use the retina data set, which consists of retinal fundus photographs, and then there's also the chest x-ray images over here. So over here, they're saying like they both have 5 classes. So compared to like the ImageNet, significantly lower. Right after that, we'd start talking about the models and performance evaluation of the transfer learning. So they did select multiple neural network architectures and then evaluated their performance. When first of all they checked the training from the random initialization, they also checked it from doing transfer from the ImageNet. And so um, from there, they also looked into other data sets as well that they talk about. So, okay, in ImageNet models, right? One thing to note is that most of the parameters are concentrated at the top because we do have 10,000 class classification. So most of the parameters are at the top of the top layers of ImageNet. And so that basically is where the ImageNet models are highly over parameterized. And as we mentioned, like they just have 5 classes. So that's where the potential comes to like um, combat this problem of over parameterization. They also found that um, the family of smaller lightweight convolutional layers was comparable. And okay, so this the thing with this research paper that I find is like really repetitive. And so I mean, you keep seeing the same thing, and it's just trying to exaggerate the point that, see, listen, medical imaging with transfer learning is not significantly impacting the performance, and the smaller lightweight neural networks are basically similar to the complex ones. It's really not making a difference. And they also observe that these conclusions are in the setting of very limited data. So that is one thing to note too, because obviously like ImageNet has a lot of data, but the medical images do not. In terms of the description of the model, this part is very interesting because they evaluate ResNet and they use exception v3, which are basically convolutional neural network architectures, and they've been used in many medical transfer learning applications. So the thing about this is, for like the generic sequence for this is a 2D convolutional layer, and then they have batch normalization too, and they have a ReLU activation function. And so they have like each architecture has 4 to 5 repetitions of this basic layer, and they call this model family of like these repetitions CBR. CBR is a really important term to note because it does talk about it a lot in the paper. And so, because of this, they get a family of architectures with sizes that are different. So they have CBR large, CBR tiny, different CBRs. And so that's why it's really important because they do mention it a lot. In terms of the results, they evaluated 3 repetition of the different models and the initializations. So they looked at random initialization versus pre-trained weights. So there were 2 possibilities within this. So either what they could do, and this is going back to the fact like this is how the status quo is, right? Because again, as I mentioned, you have the architecture, you have the pre-trained weights, you're putting them together, then you're fine-tuning them against the medical imaging tasks. So in this, there's 2 ways you could go about this. So first of all, what you could do is you could have the pre-trained weights, right, from the ResNet or like the Inception volume 3. So you could have the pre-trained weights, and then you would do many training runs from there to get like, an accurate model. That's one. Now another one is instead of using weights, now you're using the Imagenet architecture. So remember, we had either weights or architecture, so it's like 2 different things instead of binding them together. So in the second one, as I mentioned, we have the Imagenet architecture where we're using the architecture and fine tuning it on the medical task. And so what they did, they opted for the first one, which is using pre-trained weights and multiple training runs from that initialization. And I actually agree with that because the thing is like ImageNet, there were so many differences, right? So you might as well go with some sort of model that has some similarity. It's more simple, it's more lightweight. So for all the models except for exception V3, which is basically all the pre-trained weights were provided by this reference in the research paper and like reference 26 over here. Um, the rest of them were trained on ImageNet to get the pre-trained weights, right? So that's basically how they got the pre-trained weights. And so after that, we see that transfer learning again, it's the same thing all over again that we're looking at the fact that it didn't help a lot. And so even in the this is shown even in the tables over here, you see that this is the random initialization and then you have the transfer, but then you see like literally look at this is a 0.3% difference if you use transfer learning, and then if you randomly initialize it, like it's barely increasing. So at this point, like there's obviously not a significant change in the performance as well. So that's basically it. And then it goes on to talk about like how there's not that much data, right? And we talked about this. So to study the effects, what they did is that they from their retina data set, they took 5,000 data points, and then you see like when you have a very small data set, there's benefits of transfer learning because it did increase, like, okay, at least over here in the ResNet, it increased by a bit. And then it didn't increase as much, but it did increase. Like over there, it didn't, over here, it didn't increase that much. Over here, it did. So from that, we can conclude that um, the benefits of transfer learning with small data are basically because of the architecture size and the fact that you don't have the problem with over parameterization. Moving on to this part. So over here, this was also a very important model because it talks about how pre-trained weights, they produce different hidden representations from random initialization. And so over here, they're using this thing called CCA to find like similarity scores. And CCA is talked about here too. It's basically like to understand how pre-training affects features and representations that are learned by the model, but essentially over here, like it's trying to find the similarities, right? You can just think of it as a way to find the similarities between the weights after like when comparing the random initialization and then the transfer learning and how that really works. So over here, you see that you have the comparison between the random initialization for the ImageNet models and then the this is the random initialization, this is the training. So over here, you can see that there's a very low similarity, like it's really far apart from each other, the ResNet and the Inception Volume 3, after training the 2 models, where one is, again, randomly initialized and the other one is pre-trained. But then you look at this one, you compare it and you can see like over here, the spacing, right? It's pretty, there's a high similarity, relatively high similarity after training two randomly initialized models. And so over here, you can see again, representations learned from random initialization are more similar to each other over here than those from pre-trained weights for larger models with less distinction for smaller models. So that's also a factor that it plays, the architecture size, and then also, how we talked about the layers and right, the similarities between them. Then it starts talking about the representational analysis of the effects of transfer. And so it talks about how in section 3 we saw that transfer learning and the training from random initialization, they had a very similar performance. And so that obviously has those open questions that we briefly touched upon, where it's like, well, then why does transfer learning even exist? Like, what are some of the benefits, or are the effects of the initialization lost? Or does the feature reuse to take place? Why is it not really increasing the performance? And so to understand this, they had an approach that directly analyzed and compared the hidden representations based on the different populations of the neural networks, and they used this thing called the CCA, which is basically the, I'm going to try to pronounce this, canonical correlation analysis. And then there's also the DSV, which is singular vector, in the first part of the abbreviation. And so this basically reveals an important dependence on the model size, like how does that impact, and the behavior between the lower and higher layers of a model, how does that really impact the effects of the transfer? So that's what they're trying to find. And then in section 5, they actually end up talking about a new hybrid approach to transfer learning, which I found really interesting as well. So, in terms of quantitatively studying high representations with the CCA, they're trying to understand how pre-training affects the features and representations. So, in terms of the representations, is looking at hidden representations, as the subtitle says. So, a representation of a neuron is basically how it goes from the input to an output. It's basically that sort of representation. And so hidden representations basically is the same thing, except it's done for hidden layers, which basically is the in between. So we have the input layers, we have the output layer, and then the middle is the hidden layers. So the hidden representations are the part of the feature learning and that represent the data from the hidden layers. And then they'd also like to learn intermediate functions, which are basically the latent layers. And looking at the latent layers, so latent space is basically like representation of data that's compressed in like a similar way so that they're closer together in terms of space. So what I mean by that is if you look at the screenshot over here, this is an article that I found where if you're trying to classify an image using a convolutional neural network architecture, you see that over here when it's trying to learn, and this is also done with the 2D segmentation UNet model, where it's trying to decrease the size over here so that it can learn more. And so it's compressed over here, which is called the encoder. And then again, we're reconstructing it, we're compressing now. And so um, that's just increasing it, right? And the point of this is to just get like a more precise and like less computationally expensive approach to these sort of problems with segmentation. I guess classification could be used for this too. But anyways, this part over here is like where it's compressed the data, right? So this would be the latent space representation. So the latent layers, such as this is called the bottleneck. So the thing about this is like when you're analyzing latent representation, there's two things about it. First of all, it's really challenging because of the complexity of it, right? Finding the complexity, and then like the mapping, finding the mapping of the inputs and outputs in the other layers, like just mapping it all together, especially within hidden layers, like it's a very complicated process. And so this is why we have a tool called singular vector canonical correlation analysis, so SVCCA, so CCA basically. And so it basically does that exact thing where um, it is trying to work directly with the model parameters, or it's working with the neuron activation vectors. So it's not working with like the neurons itself or like the model parameters, it's working with the activations after there's the input, right? And then after the output, like the output is in terms of the activation. So that's what it's looking for. And so it the point of it is like when you're using the CCA methods, you're preventing the size of the activation sets from overwhelming, and that's basically helping to mitigate the problem of the overparameterization that we talked about as well. And over here we're also giving a similarity score that we mentioned. And yeah, that is pretty much it for the quantitatively studying hidden representations. Then we have transfer learning and random initialization. And or the first experiment that they did was to compare the similarity again. This was like kind of a continuation, right, of the hidden representations when they trained from the pre-trained weights and then when they trained from the random initialization, and the difference between that in terms of the hidden representations. And so they did these representations at the top two layers, or for the CBRs, which are again are like the model family that we talked about, or the stages, which is used for like Inception and ResNet. And so you're looking at their similarity scores, and then as a baseline they also look at the similarity scores when when doing the random initialization from two different seeds. And seeds are basically what initializes the random generator for the random initialization, like the random number generator. So because of that, like, you know, it's gonna be a bit more accurate because, when you're averaging the similarity scores, you have more of a broad like scope to consider as well. And then for larger models, they realize that there's a clear difference between representations, with the similarity of the representations from the random initialization and then the pre-trained weights as well. So this is what figure 3 is actually trying to explain, is that if you have per layer CCA similarities, um, for all the models, like you see that for especially for ResNet, especially you see like in the beginning over here, I'll zoom in a bit. Over here, you see that there was a big drop in terms of the weight, right? It wasn't like very stable, but then you see that near the end, like the last two layers, especially, the feature reuse is mostly restricted. And what I mean by that is like there wasn't much of a change. And so that happened with the ResNet. And just to mention, like the gray dotted line over here, it shows that comparison, the difference between the pre-trained, which is in like the yellow orangish color, and then the blue, which is the random initialization. In figure 4 and then over here as well, they start talking about how large models, they move less through the training at lower layers. So this is basically what it's trying to say here, like they're moving less, the weights are moving less as you go through the lower layers of the model. And over here this is also talking about the same thing, so I won't go over that too much. So then we move on to filter visualization and the absence of gapers. So in terms of this, the thing about gapers is basically that gapers are some sort of linear filter that's used for texture analysis. So this is a pretty good example of it. So it basically analyzes whether there's some sort of specific frequency when in like a localized region of an image, and you're like looking to see uh, like what the regions are surrounding the point or the region of analysis. And you can see like in this picture, right, depending on the theta value and the frequency value, like there's many differences. So like over here, the frequency value does make a difference too, like in terms of the contrast and how high it is. And then the theta value also does make a difference in terms of, um, I believe this would be more of like how um, how intense this filter is. In terms of like you see like how these specks, they're like way tinier than these ones. These are more like blurry and kind of big. So these are just like connections I'm making, but honestly, I don't know too much about Gabor filters. So the thing about this, they wanted to just visualize it, right? Because obviously, like you could have data, but then if you have like something that's qualitative, that helps as well. And so this was, they basically said that it was just adding information to what was already mentioned in the observation, right? You can see over here that the ResNet initializations, and then um, you see like the final of the, what's it called, the pre-trained weights. Like you can see that they're really similar, but then you look at this one and they're so different. So um, the thing is, like, what we think, or what the researchers think in this case, is that the CBR small, which is this right here, it it doesn't really appear to learn the Gabor filters over here, because you see like how this learned the Gabor filters, this kind of did, but then you compare this and this is like not really like similar to each other at all. So it's just saying like it might even erase some of the Gabor filters that it's initialized within. So the last point I want to mention here, and obviously there's more, but like this is a main thing that they had, was convergence. And convergence is basically and I believe I mentioned this, but if I didn't, it's basically the progression in which a model goes to learn all these features and basically responds to some sort of pattern within the images. It finds those edges and then it makes those connections, makes those edges shapes, those shapes figures, those figures, it turns into some sort of image. And so that's what's really happening with this. So in this section, although there might not be benefits in terms of the performance, they found that transfer learning offers feature independent benefits to the convergence speeds because of the weight scaling that it does. And then it also uses weights from the lowest two layers in the stages because it has the biggest effect on the convergence. And it talks about this in the previous section too, where it looked at the lowest two layers, and then you saw that there wasn't that much of an effect in terms of the weights and the parameters changing up. And so that's what it means by like, that convergence. It's like speeding up the process. So that's what it talks about here. But obviously, like it goes more in depth over here on page 8, because then it starts talking about, first of all, the feature independent benefits of transfer and weight scaling. So over here, again, we're just looking at the fact that it's faster convergence. And I didn't look into this too much because the math formulas did mess me up a bit. But essentially, the high level explanation of this is that there's faster convergence. And one explanation for this is that there's a significant feature reuse. And feature reuse is essentially concatenation. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the unit segmentation model, but it's similar to what we saw over here. This is kind of like the unit segmentation model, and it doesn't obviously explain the entire architecture, but with the um, feature reuse, you're basically concatenating information from early layers in the architecture to later layers in near that are closer to the output. And it's basically allowing for more precise localization. And so just enabling the fact that, I want to get more information about the image in order to localize where it is. This is specific to segmentation, so I'm not 100% sure if this is what's being applied here, but I'm pretty sure the phenomenon's quite the same in terms of concatenation, because if you know more about the image, you're concatenating information about the image to the end layers. And so not only is that helping with the convergence, obviously with the speed, it's also like the computer doesn't need to know as much, because now it has some sort of idea on what to look for within those images, because you now have more insight into it. There's also weight transfusion and feature reuse, which is actually pretty interesting they um because they were looking at like, does this really impact to the lowest two layers or stages of the network, and is that what the effect on the convergence speed, is that what's leading to it? And so because of that, they did a weight transfusion experiment, and over here they basically had a set of pre-trained weights and randomly initialized the rest of the network. So it was kind of like this hybrid model for the medical task. So they use pre-trained weights for the lowest few layers, and it basically showed that it has the biggest training speed up. And that was really interesting, how it just sped up in the last 2 layers depending on the different experiments it did, like all tied together. And that's what I found really interesting about this too. And that's why, like, when they were like, okay, for the last 2 layers we want to have the pre-trained weights, well, why don't we just make the entire thing hybrid? Because clearly for some parts of the model it works, for some parts it doesn't. So the transfusion results, they're suggesting some hybrid and more flexible approach to transfer learning. So firstly, for larger models such as the resonant model, they want to use pre-trained weights. So this is for larger models, for up to block 2, right? So more in like the top of the network. And then the rest of it would basically be um, things like random initialization. So that's what it would consist of. And that is basically what it's trying to say. Like for larger networks, that's how it would work. And then obviously for smaller networks, it would be the same. But that's what it says in sort of its takeaways, that they want a hybrid approach to transfer learning because they found out that some things work, some things don't. And that was pretty much it for the takeaways. The conclusion was, again, we'll recap this, is that first of all, there wasn't a significant change in the performance. Second of all, there's much smaller architectures can actually perform at a very close um, close rate or efficiency, you could call it, in term when comparing it to the standard ImageNet models, which are a lot more complex. And this is because of the evidence shown due to the over-parameterization for the task as well. They're also talking about how they found that feature reuse was meaningful, that concatenation of the information, because it also helped with the hybrid approach as well. And so that is the end of the research paper. I really hope you enjoyed. And honestly, like, this is having this hybrid model, like, I just found it so interesting how you can have like really novel innovations in these sort of research papers where you're doing some experiments just to test out a few things, and you come up with some sort of novel approach where it's hybrid in this case. Because if things are not working clearly and things are working, like, why not just combine that together so you can have one very optimized solution? So I just found that really interesting and hope you did too.